All right, welcome back, grade 9s. This is lesson 2 of chapter 6. Lesson 1, define well-being. Lesson 2 is going to be an introduction to economic systems. Again, economic systems is 40% of the grade 12 year, so please hang on to your notes. And typically at the beginning of the economic unit in grade 12, I will introduce a problem to the class and see if anybody can come up with the word that I'm trying to associate the problem with. So I'm going to plant this in this seed, this idea with you now. I'm going to even give you the answer so that in 3 years, when we have social 30-1 together, you're going to put up your hand and you're going to be like, scarcity. And I'll be like, absolute, that's the word. So the problem is, I often ask my class, why do we have an economic system? You know, why does Canada have an economic system? Why did the Soviet Union have a communist economic system? You know, why do the Scandinavian countries have what we'd identify as socialist economic systems? So even if they have different values and therefore have, you know, different types of economic systems, why does each country need an economic system? And the answer is scarcity. That if we could just go outside, like we just did, and if we could just pick from the ground everything we needed, there'd be no need for an economic system. And if I could think everything into creation, I would not need someone to make clothing for me. I could just think clothes into creation. If we had replicators like they have on Star Trek, and I could just go up to the machine and say, tea, Earl Grey, hot, and then the tea was there, we might not need an economic system. But we have a need for an economic system currently because we have scarcity. Because we have limited resources. We have finite resources. We only have so much oil. We only have so much natural gas. We only have so much, you know, the building blocks of goods and services. So because we only have so much, we need to figure out, well, who gets it? You know, who gets it? We only have so much wealth in Canada. How do we figure out who gets the wealth? So we have houses in Wetaskiwin. How do we figure out who gets which house? How do we figure out who gets which car? How did we figure out who gets which shoes today? So these are all products that are purchased in a marketplace that is part of an economy that is created so that we can deal with our finite resources. You know, maybe if the world had less population and we're living in some kind of Garden of Eden, we wouldn't need an economy. Just walk around and pick from this tree what I need, and pick from that tree what I need, and pick from the ground what I need here, and there's caves to live in, and it sounds very idyllic. But in a world of 8 billion people and limited resources, we have economic systems. We have scarcity, we have economic systems. There are countries, there are cities without clean water. So who gets the little bit of water that is clean within those cities? Well, they have to figure out that within an economic system. So one of the things to think about when we introduce economic systems is, well, why do we have them? And the answer is because we have scarcity. So we have nearly unlimited wants. Nearly unlimited. We might be able to reach the end of it. You know, if I said to you, you know, could you spend $1 million? You might be able to spend $1 million today. Could you spend 100 million? You might be able to, because there's houses that are $100 million. Could you spend $1 billion? You might be able to, but there might be a number that you couldn't spend that much money. And that's why I say we have nearly unlimited wants. There might be a point where you're like, you know what? I already have 12 cars like that. I don't need a 13th car like that. I already have, you know, a tropical island. I don't need another tropical island. I already have a submarine and a helicopter. I already have all of these things. My wants have been met. So I would say that for almost everybody that's ever been alive, we don't get to the point where our wants have all been met. But I would say that we have nearly unlimited wants then. And because we have nearly unlimited wants, we have to have a system in place to decide who gets their wants satisfied. Should the economy of Wetaskiwin be focused on creating more Sour Patch Kids? Because those seem pretty popular here today. You guys are passing around those Sour Patch Kids like they're amazing. And I gotta say, seeing the Sour Patch Kids, making their rounds a little bit, I'm thinking, man, I want some Sour Patch Kids now. I think Sour Patch Kids are pretty cool. It tastes really good. So, whose wants should be taken care of first? That's part of an economic system. Is to prioritize, what should the economy be producing? And then who gets what is produced? Who are we producing it for? Is it those in most need or those with the most money? So who are we producing things for? What should we produce? How should we allocate it? How should we distribute it? How do we decide who gets it? How should we produce things? These are all basic economic questions. And the way you answer your basic economic questions is typically influenced by values. If you value cooperation, if you value selflessness, if you value empathy and compassion, if we have limited stuff, then who gets it? The answer might be, well, who needs it the most? If you value compassion and cooperation and empathy, then who gets the Cliff Bar, the chocolate chunk with sea salt Cliff Bar? Well, it might not be who's willing to pay the most. It might be who really needs it right now. Who's hungry? They're the ones who gets it. So that's an example of a more collectivist. Remember, we began the course by looking at individualism and collectivism. That's an example of more of a collectivist approach to economics. Who gets what is produced? Who needs it? Not who can pay the most for it. There are people that need a car, but they can't afford a car, so they walk. And then we have billionaires that have fleets of cars, and they don't even use them all. They're just in storage. They're like trophies. So that's a difference between an economy based on collectivism, who needs it, and an economy based on individualism, who can afford it. So far in our introduction to economics, we've suggested that we need economic systems because of scarcity. And we have scarcity because we have finite resources. We don't have an infinite amount of oil. We will run out. And oil is the lifeblood of the modern day economy. So we have finite resources, but we have nearly infinite wants and needs. And when you magnify our personal wants and needs by 8 billion people, yeah, we have more wants and needs than we have resources on the planet. So then we have to decide, well, what should we be focused on? Today, should Mr. McBride be focusing his energy on creating new hardcore gangster rap music? Is there an audience for that? Would I get paid for that? Does the world need that? Do we need more angry, bald guy rap music? Or did Eminem do enough of that for us? Has he fulfilled that niche? Maybe I can do something different for the economy, right? So that's a part of it, is, within the economy, within the finite resources of an economy, where should we allocate our resources? Towards which wants and needs? And when we do that, in summary, we're exposing our values. So if we say, let's produce what is needed by the group, not what profitable, not what is profitable, but what is needed, what is life-saving, then we're putting the interests of others before us. That collective good, common interest is collectivism. But if we say, you know what, I don't care what people need, I care what's profitable, that's individualism. So within this unit on economics, we'll be looking at individualism and collectivism again. And economies that practice collectivism are typically defined as socialist or communist, communism being an authoritarian version of socialism. And economies that practice individualism are capitalist. And we'll see that countries like Canada have nuances of both. So in Canada, for public health care, for public education, these are examples of collectivist things in our economy. That I don't own this classroom, neither do you, but we collectively do own this. This is public property. And we have public education in Canada because we value education as a springboard to a better quality of life. So, we're about to introduce the idea of economics. So far in your notes of chapter 9, you have well-being, and you got some notes. You might have copied down something from my beginning rant. If not, good news, you can go back and rewatch this on YouTube. And then when you rewatch it, you might be like, dude, I didn't hear any of that the first time you mentioned that. I heard something about Sour Patch Kids, and then I was confused. Because I was distracted, because I'm like, wait, there's Sour Patch Kids? I didn't see any Sour Patch Kids. I'd like some. So, let's watch the video. I'll interrupt it at places. But the goal here is to introduce the chapter, introduce the concept, introduce the title, Economic Systems.
Hello everybody, and welcome to an introduction to economic systems. This video, which was created for the Grade 9 Social Studies Program of Studies in Alberta, defines and provides an overview for market, mixed, and centrally planned economies. It will also highlight traditional economies. An economic system is the way a society organizes the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services.
So, an economic system is the way we organize the production, distribution, and consumption of resources and goods and services. So it's about production, it's about distribution, and it's about consumption. Just production. What should we produce? Production. What should we produce? What is needed? Consumption. Who gets it? Right? Allocation. How do we hand it out to them? You know, do they get it based upon need? Do they get it based upon the ability to pay?
For our purposes in this unit, we will specifically be looking at the economic systems of Canada and the United States. A traditional economy is an agricultural or agrarian society. An example of an agrarian society would be the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. Remember,
so we don't have a lot of traditional economies left in 2020 in the world. So traditional economy, when you think of traditional, maybe think pre-industrial revolution. So people still functioning, doing the same jobs that they may have been able to do hundreds or even thousands of years ago. So she gives the example of the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. That's a good example of a traditional economy. An agrarian society where we have individuals that are still using the same farming practices that they could have used 3,000 years ago.
we learned about this in grade 8 social studies when we watched the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. In a traditional economy, it does not have any industry. So in other words, they do not use any machines. Instead, they use their hands or other devices they have created from resources in their environment. In a centrally planned economy, individual consumers have little influence on economic decisions.
Next up, we have central planned economics, centrally planned economies. And centrally planned economies are ones that are centrally planned by the government. Oh, you're all done? So when it says centrally planned by the government, what we mean is that the government is making those decisions. So what were the big decisions? Well, what should we produce? The government's going to answer that. So in a free market economy, what should we produce is decided by the good people at, fill in the blank corporation, Coca-Cola, right? Or GM. GM decides what to produce. They're like, hey, let's build a car that looks like this. In a centrally planned economy, it's not GM that decides it, it's the government that decides it. So they may say, you know what, GM? You're going to make tanks instead of Jeeps. GM, instead of making, trucks, we need you to make what am I trying to say? We'll get you to create, personnel carriers, right? We're going to get you to create maybe guns. So They might go to Boeing or Lockheed Martin and say, instead of creating passenger airplanes, commercial airplanes, we need you to create missiles. We need you to create surface-to-air missiles. We need you to create maybe some cruise missiles, maybe some Tomahawk cruise missiles. Maybe we need to create satellites with laser beams that can shoot things down. We need to create weapons. So a centrally planned economy, it's the government that says what to produce. And in Stalin's USSR, there's an old economic battle between guns and butter. In Stalin's USSR, the centrally planned economy under the central planners called Gosplan, they said, you know what, we're producing guns at the expense of butter. Butter, a metaphor for all things that consumers need to eat. And because they didn't produce enough to eat, famine resulted. So centrally planned equals government planners. Private planned equals corporation gets to decide. So if Coca-Cola wants to create Coca-Cola, then so be it. That's their choice. Central plan, government plans it. Often, they will have big visions. Like the story Animal Farm, where the central planning pigs have these big projects that they want to do to prove that pigs are worthy.
Decision making. An example of a country that currently practices this model is Cuba. In Cuba, the government controls and operates all industries, including hotels, restaurants, museums, banks, taxis, and supermarkets. All resources are publicly owned. This means the government owns them. Because of this, the government makes the decisions about how to use resources. In a mixed economy, some resources are publicly owned, while others are privately owned.
So the key thing with mixed is, it's in the middle. There's a mix. There's some public, there's some private. Canada's a mix. How do we know it's a mix? Look around the room you're in. This is public education. We have public hospitals. That's public. But we also have private. Walmart is not owned by the government. Walmart is owned by the Walton family of the United States of America. And they have a lot of money. So Canada is a mixed economy because we have both private and public. Cuba is more of a public economy, more of a centrally planned economy.
An example of a country using this model is Canada. For example, Canada Post is owned and operated by the government.
But then we also have private companies that compete with Canada Post. Companies like FedEx, right? FedEx. We'll go with FedEx.
However, the Calgary Flames are owned and operated by a private businessman. In this type of economy, individuals and the government both make decisions about what to produce. For example, with CBC News and Radio, the government has quite an influence over what is produced. However, in a company like Tim Hortons, the government has no involvement at all. Both individual consumers and the government influence decision making. In a market economy, resources are privately owned. An example of a country that practices this model is the United States of America.
So this is still a bit of an oversimplification. So being able to teach you the three types of economies, market, mixed, and centrally planned, they're oversimplifying things. You could go to Cuba and find private property. You can go to the United States and find public property. So in effect, everything really is a mixed economy, because you can see both public and private in every country in the world. But in order to be able to teach you the difference of these three types, they're exaggerating the extremes a little bit. So they're suggesting that the United States is a market economy when there is some public stuff in the US. Public libraries, there are some public hospitals and public schools. But at the same time, there's less public stuff in the US than there is here. So relative to Canada, the United States looks like a market economy. It looks like a laissez-faire economy. It looks like a capitalist economy. It looks like an economy based on individualism. Relative to us, Cuba has more public property, more government central planning. So relative to Canada, Cuba looks to be centrally planned. So it has been said that every economy in the world today is a mix. But for the purposes of Social 9, we need to exaggerate the extremes just so we can teach you what they would look like. And relative to most countries in the world, the United States looks very much like a market economy. Because when you go to the US, you can see a lot of capitalism, a lot of private property, a lot of private enterprise. Whereas if you go to Cuba, you'd see the opposite. A lot of centrally planned economics, a lot of public enterprise.
In the US, individuals make decisions on how to use resources. Individuals are free to make their own decisions with little or no government intervention. Resources are the private property of persons or companies. Companies sell their product to consumers who make their own decision about what to buy. Businesses succeed if they produce what consumers want. Otherwise, they fail. Thus, individual consumers drive economic decision-making by choosing what to buy. Different ideas about how to best organize an economy result in different economic systems, which can be placed on a continuum much like political parties. In its most basic form, the economic continuum is merely just a line. The more you move on...
And we talked about the spectrums at the beginning of the course. So in terms of an economic spectrum, you can see that based upon the simplicity of Social 9, we put market economies on the right, mixed economies in the middle, and planned economies on the left. So based upon what we've seen with these three case studies, we're seeing Cuba would be over here, United States would be over here, and Canada is somewhere in the middle. Now maybe in Alberta, we're a little bit further to the right, because there's more private enterprise and private interest and public interest in Alberta. But as we continue to see the growth of government and the introduction of universal daycare and things like that, Canada has drifted from individualism, freedom from government, towards more socialism. We're in the middle where now we're recognizing we need freedom through government. We need to invite the government into our lives and allow the government to answer some of these questions so that everyone can have a good quality of life.
On this continuum depends on how much or how little government involvement the economy has. However, a country's place on the continuum does not always stay the same. Instead, its position depends on the underlying values of a society and its current government. For example, in Canada, depending on which political party is in power will determine how much government funding a business or a social program will receive. Now that you have...
So currently in Canada, just to go back to that last slide, currently in Canada we have Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government. And his Liberal government's a minority government. And in order to stay in power, he has created some alliances with the NDP. NDP is our left of center party, our Liberals are our centrist party. So politically right now, we should assume, and economically, that we're being pulled towards the left. And we can see that in some of the policies that Trudeau has created in response to COVID-19, that he is taking more government control. He's saying, I don't want people living in poverty. Here's some assistance.
Receive. Now that you have been provided with an overview of the different economic systems that exist in our world, a task has been presented. In your own words, demonstrate your understanding of centrally planned, mixed, and market economies.
All right, so look down at your notes and see if you have something down on that. Do you have some notes down on, what is a centrally planned economy? How is it different than a market economy? And then what's a mixed economy? These are the outcomes that are measurable.
Be sure to include your preference of economic system and why. You can
So we're not actually going to do that assignment, but that's a beginning to our economic unit. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of time. You just sat through a couple of my lectures here. I'm going to give you a little bit more time now to go back into the booklets, and then I'll interrupt you in another half hour, and we'll look at the third lesson of this chapter.